Senate Republicans disagree with the president.
ISIS and al-Qaeda have yet to be defeated, and American national security interests require continued commitment to our missions.
That's Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell there.
Yeah, as the Senate did something it does not do that often. Republicans have been reluctant to break with President Trump, even when some may disagree with him, but they did just that yesterday, rebuking his decision to withdraw troops from Syria and Afghanistan.
NPR White House correspondent Scott Horsley is with us this morning. Hi, Scott.
Good morning, Rachel.
As Steve noted, it is not that often that Republicans publicly break with President Trump on policy. Tell us exactly what was voted on yesterday. What are the consequences of it?
Well, Rachel, this rebuke of the president was big, and it was bipartisan. 68 senators voted for this resolution, including 43 out of 53 of Trump's fellow Republicans. The resolution is non-binding, but it does give a strong sense of the Senate that a precipitous withdrawal from Syria and Afghanistan could put at risk what senators called the hard-won military gains that the U.S. has in those countries.
And of course, the president had come out and said explicitly that he wants all troops out of Syria and kind of rip the rug out from under negotiators in Afghanistan who are trying to come up with a peace deal. I mean, do you think Senate Republicans felt emboldened because of what they heard from intelligence officials this week on Capitol Hill?
Well, certainly that was one of a number of areas where the intelligence community took issue with what the president has been saying. They stressed that ISIS has certainly not been defeated, even though its territorial holdings have been dramatically reduced. They said there's still a lot of ISIS fighters out there, and they still pose a potential threat.
Scott, I just want to note, I'm trying to do a little bit of math on the fly here. You said 43 Republicans voted to rebuke the president, that 68 overall did. It sounds to me like Democrats actually were more divided on this than Republicans were, that Republicans were strongly in favor of keeping troops in Syria and Afghanistan.
Well, and in particular, the senators who are running for president were mostly opposed to this resolution.
What does this mean practically for U.S. policy in these countries? I mean, is this just talk, as we often hear, or does this actually affect the Pentagon's plans?
Hard to say for sure. Obviously, this is not the first rebuke of the president. This is the issue that forced the resignation of Trump's defense secretary, Jim Mattis, as well as his anti-ISIS czar, Brett McGurk. And the president himself has already backpedaled somewhat, at least in terms of the timing of withdrawing troops from Syria. Remember, back in mid-December when he first announced this move, it was supposed to be virtually immediate. But then after a Christmas visit to Iraq, the president suggested, well, if the military needs a little bit more time, that's fine with him. In now the month and a half or so since the president's announcement, we've actually seen very little in the way of troop withdrawal, although there has been some equipment pulled out of Syria.
Right.
So we'll see.
Just briefly before I let you go, another rift between Congress and the president, obviously border security. This bipartisan group is trying to negotiate a deal to prevent another shutdown. President Trump now indicating none of what they are doing actually matters?
In an interview with the New York Times, the president suggested that he is prepared to go ahead with a national emergency if the Democrats don't give ground at the bargaining table, although we should say he has hinted that before and hasn't pulled the trigger yet.
NPR White House correspondent Scott Horsley. Thanks, Scott.
You're welcome.
Here's a startling number. More than 130 people in the United States die every day because of an overdose on opioids.
One common culprit is the painkiller OxyContin, which is produced by Purdue Pharma. And we now have a bit more information about the way that Purdue Pharma spread the use of that drug. New disclosures came from a lawsuit against Purdue Pharma in Massachusetts. They allegedly show that a member of the Sackler family, which owns Purdue, gave directions to the company in an email, and this email said to prioritize selling higher doses of OxyContin in 2008. That order came even after the company had admitted to misleading the public about the drug's risk of addiction. The disclosures also allege, by the way, that the Sacklers earned more than $4 billion in opioid profits just since 2007.
Martha Biebinger of WBUR is here to give us even more details. Martha, people will hear that and think this is awful. Were people profiting knowing that these drugs were highly addictive?
That's right. This is a lawsuit, Rachel, that was filed by the Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey. She is claiming that Purdue and the Sacklers marketed the opioid drugs as safe, even though they knew the risk of addiction, and in doing so did help cause the opioid epidemic. Now, this is all playing out in Massachusetts, one of the hardest hit states, where between 5 and 6 residents are dying every day on average. And one report found that Massachusetts lost $15.2 billion as a result of the epidemic in 2017 alone.
What more can you tell us about these new filings that came out last night?
Well, the latest version of the complaint, which is the heart of this lawsuit that's been filed, lifts hundreds of lines that had been blacked out. So what we see now are board notes about payments that allegedly totaled hundreds of millions of dollars a year to the Sacklers. In 2009, for example, the complaint says the Sacklers paid themselves $335 million. They spent $122 on sales reps to ramp up their profits. At the same time, they allegedly acknowledged the harm OxyContin was causing by approving $2.7 million in personal injury claims. So, Rachel and Steve, there's some more in here. There's emails directly from the Sackler member, as Steve mentioned earlier, pushing for greater sales, allegedly. There's talk of Purdue starting to sell drugs that would to treat addiction. So that's the problem they were allegedly fostering. Yeah. And also getting into the business of Narcan, the drug that reverses an opioid overdose. That plan did not go forward.
There are hundreds of lawsuits against Purdue in states and cities across the country for the company's role in the opioid epidemic. So how could this case in Massachusetts have an influence over those other suits?
Hundreds of those lawsuits are consolidated in one court in Ohio. The documents used to build this case that we're talking about in Massachusetts are all on file in Ohio. Massachusetts was the first state and the first suit to name the Sacklers and other board members, but other parties could use that same model going forward.
Any word from the Sacklers and Purdue on any of this?
The attorney for the Sacklers claim they don't even belong in the lawsuit. The attorney plans to argue that there's no jurisdiction because they had no direct dealings in Massachusetts. And Purdue says Massachusetts is just trying to vilify them, even though they had a small piece of the market, and that the complaint is riddled with inaccurate allegations.
Wow. Important story. WBUR's Martha Biebinger for us this morning about it. Thanks so much, Martha. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
NPR has learned about a new experiment that's being conducted here in the U.S. aimed at creating gene-edited human embryos.
Now, let's be clear. This experiment is not trying to make gene-edited babies. The world condemned a scientist for saying he'd done that in China. The goal of this new experiment is to see if it may someday be possible to safely make more gene-edited babies to prevent genetic diseases, seeing if it is someday possible. But this is still a controversial idea.
NPR health correspondent Rob Stein is breaking this exclusive news today, and he joins us this morning. Rob, who is conducting this experiment?
So, Rachel, the scientist's name is Dieter Eggli, and he's a developmental biologist at Columbia University in New York. And he says he's just trying to do the basic research to find out if a powerful new gene editing technique known as CRISPR can repair genetic mutations in human embryos, in the hopes of possibly someday allowing parents carrying genetic mutations that cause terrible diseases to have healthy babies. In this case, he's trying to fix a mutation that causes blindness.
So can you remind us how this is different than what happened in China?
Yeah, so that scientist announced that 2 twin girls had been born using embryos that he had edited with CRISPR in his lab. And he said he did it to try to make them immune to the AIDS virus. But that was universally kind of condemned for being irresponsible and unethical because he rushed ahead before anyone knows if this kind of thing really works and, more importantly, would be safe.
So this New York scientist, he's trying to do the basic research to answer these important questions. Why is what he is doing controversial?
Right. So many scientists think this is exactly the kind of basic research that needs to be done if anyone's ever going to know whether, it might be possible to repair genetic defects in human embryos, and safely prevent genetic diseases. But others say, look, even just doing the basic research might encourage other scientists to go rogue. And you're just kind of creating the recipe for how this could be abused to, for example, try to make designer babies. And that raises all kinds of really profound moral and ethical questions.
Right. What is his response to that critique?
So he says, look, I'm not trying to make gene-edited babies yet. I'm nowhere near that, and I have no intention of making, designer babies. I'm doing the opposite of what happened in China. I'm trying to be very careful and methodical. Let's listen to a little bit of what he had to say.
We can't just do the editing and then hope everything goes right and implant that into a womb. That's not responsible. We have to first do the basic research to see what happens. That's what we are doing here.
Huh.
Right, and he's also trying to be really, transparent and not be secretive, like some people say. The Chinese scientist says he's even let me, come to his lab recently and literally stand over his shoulder as he pierced human eggs with a tiny needle to fertilize them with sperm, carrying this blindness mutation, and then did his experiment to see if this CRISPR gene editing tool could fix the mutation. And here's a key moment during that experiment. Let's listen to a little bit of that.
The membrane is broken. Breached. There we go. Sperm and CRISPR tool in the egg.
Oh, you did it. You got it.
Yeah, got it.
Nerve-wracking.
Very.
I can't believe you were allowed to watch that.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. And it was, it went on for hours. He edited one egg after another, fertilizing it, and then injecting this CRISPR tool to try to change, fix this genetic mutation. It's pretty amazing to stand there and watch this happening in real time.
Wow. Well, we'll see about the implications of all this. Pretty amazing. Rob Stein, NPR health correspondent. Rob, thanks so much for bringing us this news. We appreciate it.
Oh, sure. My pleasure, Rachel.
When he refused to resign over a racist photo, Virginia Governor Ralph Northam allowed one caveat.
Northam said if he finds that he can't govern as a result of this controversy, he will have to reassess. The governor has had several dramatic days. He was criticized for remarks about abortion, then engulfed by the story of a racist photo under his name in a medical school yearbook. First, Northam apologized. But then he said the photo wasn't him. Former allies say it's basically just too late. The previous governor, Terry McAuliffe, spoke yesterday to NPR's Michelle Martin.
This is now about Virginia, who we are as Virginians, and most importantly, how do we move forward? And he's just put himself in a position that he no longer can have that moral authority, nor can he lead the legislature and to move our state forward.
So can he govern? McAuliffe's answer is no. Northam, of course, gets to decide. For now, NPR's Sarah McCammon has been covering this story. She's in Richmond, Virginia. Sarah, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
You were at this press conference Saturday where the governor was thought to be planning to resign. Then he just said he would not. How did he explain himself?
Right, Steve. It was, I have to say, it was like a press conference I've never seen before, and I've been to a lot of political press conferences.
Yeah.
There was speculation throughout the day about whether he might resign, but word came a little bit beforehand that he didn't plan to. And he walked back his initial story. I mean, within 24 hours or so of saying, yes, I was in this photo and I'm sorry for it, he said, I actually don't believe I was in the photo. On further reflection after conversations with family and classmates, I don't think that was me. But then, Steve, he said, and I remember this, I know I would remember this, because he said he remembers another incident with regret in which he appeared in blackface for a Michael Jackson costume. This was around the same time. He said he was at a dance competition. And he said he remembers that with regret, so he's sure that he's not in the photo, and he doesn't plan to resign.
But so many questions, Sarah. Okay, so it's conceivable it's not him in the photo. It's somebody in blackface, somebody in a Klan outfit. Could be anybody there, except there was a moment when he seemed to remember it was him and admitted it. Did he explain that moment of admitting it?
Well, he said he felt a lot of pressure, a lot of responsibility to respond quickly when this news first emerged on Friday. It emerged on a blog and then was quickly confirmed by a lot of media, including NPR. And he said there was just so much hurt and shock surrounding it. He said he felt shock as well, but he felt he had to take responsibility and apologize. And he said, I was presented with the evidence. It was my yearbook page for sure. I thought it must be me. And it was even really unclear during the press conference what his state of mind was at that time. But he did indeed apologize for it and take responsibility initially.
And we'll note that in his second version of the story, he says he'd never seen that yearbook photo in all the years since 1984. Now, he says he'll stay unless he finds he can't govern, then he has to reassess. What are the factors that determine if he can govern?
Well, he's lost the support of pretty much everyone that matters in the Democratic Party, both here in Virginia and nationally. And remember, Steve, Richmond is the capital of Virginia, and there's business to get done here, not just politics. This is a really big week in the legislature, a lot of key deadlines right now. And Democrats are concerned about how to, advance their agenda. They made a lot of gains in 2017. This is an election year for the Virginia legislature. Democrats hope to make more gains. And of course, heading into 2020, this doesn't look good for Democrats here or for the party. So there's a lot of concern, both about how Northam can govern and what it says about Democrats here and nationally.
Very briefly, I guess you've been talking with voters also, right?
I've been talking with voters, and I hear really the same concerns that I've heard a lot of people who supported him say, I can forgive him as a person, but he just is not in a position to continue being a leader here.
Okay. Sarah, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Sarah McCammon. All right, after an 11-week trial, jury deliberations begin today for one of the world's most notorious drug traffickers.
His name is Joaquin Guzman. He is known widely as El Chapo, and he is the leader of the Mexican Sinaloa cartel. Guzman faces 10 charges, including leading a criminal enterprise and importing and selling large amounts of narcotics here in the U.S. If the jury convicts him, he could spend the rest of his life in prison.
NPR's Quill Lawrence watched the closing arguments of this trial, and he's on the line. Quill, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
How straightforward is this case?
Well, I mean, if you just took all of the evidence that the prosecution presented and put it on a scale next to what the defense presented, it's pretty lopsided. The prosecution had 37 days worth of witnesses. They had dozen boxes of evidence that they brought into the courtroom last week during closing arguments, including AK-47s and cans of La Comadre chilies, these cans that Chapo Guzman allegedly used in a canning factory that he would fill with cocaine and ship to the U.S. The defense called just one witness and lasted 30 minutes.
Wow, this is fascinating. First, because you have cans full of chiles, so they're being shipped through legal border crossings to the United States and they get here. Second, when you're telling me that if his guilt or innocence were judged by weight, I mean, that statue of blind justice would fall over on one side because the prosecution gave so much evidence. Right.
Yeah. And I mean, it was, you talk about the cans being shipped in the United States. The ingenuity that was presented over 11 weeks of testimony of creating this multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation, allegedly using trains and tunnels and ships and planes and submarines full of cocaine and cash. There were wiretaps. So El Chapo was allegedly obsessed with security, and he would tape all these calls. He even had an IT specialist set up a special network for him. Wow. Unfortunately, that IT specialist turned state witness. And so the jury heard all of these tapes in the courtroom. And the prosecutor was able to say, well, you heard it from this cooperating witness. You also heard El Chapo, in his own words, say, I'm sending 20 kilos of heroin to you in Chicago, etc.
Wow. Okay, so sounds pretty bad. We should note also there doesn't seem to be any doubt that El Chapo is or was a drug lord. He was a celebrity in Mexico. Many of these things were virtually happening in the open, and yet when you go into court, there is the question, did the prosecution actually charge the specific violations of law beyond a reasonable doubt? So what is the defense here for El Chapo?
Right. I mean, this guy is notorious, and he's on Netflix already. So the jury is supposed to have a blank slate, but he's already sort of infamous for having escaped prisons in Mexico. And the defense attorney really just spent his closing arguments maligning the care of all the cooperating witnesses, which was not hard to do. Some of them are credited with over 100 murders. But he never really said that El Chapo Guzman is innocent, and he barely really tried to humanize him. It was an elaborate explanation that he isn't the head of the Sinaloa cartel. That's someone else, Mayo Zambrada. But again, it seemed rather lopsided.
Okay, well, we will wait for your reporting on the verdict. Quill, thanks so much.
Hey, thanks, Steve.
That's NPR's Quill Lawrence. And now let's talk about the United Arab Emirates, where Pope Francis is visiting.
Not just visiting, making history, because it's the first time ever that a pontiff has visited the Arabian Peninsula, which is the birthplace of Islam. It is also, though, the UAE in particular, home to 1 million Catholics. Many of them are migrant workers from other countries. The Pope is going to use his trip to talk about the need for more interfaith dialogue.
NPR's Sylvia Poggioli is traveling with the Pope and joins us now from Abu Dhabi in the UAE. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, Steve.
Why would the Pope make this moment the time to visit the Arabian Peninsula?
Well, he's been invited to a big interreligious event that's taking place later today. It's part of an initiative aimed at promoting a moderate Islam and to counter religious fanaticism. For Francis, it's another milestone in Catholic-Muslim dialogue that he's been nurturing after the freeze in relations that was triggered by a controversial speech his predecessor, Benedict XVI, made in 2006 that contained a quote that linked Islam with violence. The man behind today's initiative is Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayed, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University in Cairo. It's the most important center of learning of Sunni Islam, and he and the Pope have met several times, and they've established a very good relationship.
Okay, so as an opportunity for the Pope to reach out to Muslims, but also speak directly to those 1 million Catholics we just mentioned.
Absolutely. Tomorrow he's going to celebrate a mass in a large stadium. There are about 135,000 people are expected. And some people here are already describing it as the biggest public display of Christian worship in the Islamic heartland. Because although the UAE prides itself to be a haven of tolerance, Islam is the official religion, and freedom of worship in other religions have there's a lot of restrictions. Francis may challenge his host to grant full religious freedom and also better protection for non-citizens. This is a country that's also been sharply criticized for its human rights record. Keep in mind that out of a population of 9 million, only 1 million are Emiratis. The rest are all foreigners working in this oil-rich federation.
Well, let me raise another awkward issue if I can, Sylvia. Many people have paid attention to the war in Yemen, sometimes called the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. There's a Saudi-led intervention there, and the Saudi coalition includes the United Arab Emirates. UAE warplanes have flown over Yemen dropping bombs. Is the Pope likely to bring up that?
Well, very possibly. In fact, even just before his departure yesterday in Rome, in his Sunday message from St. Peter's Square, he made some of his most forceful comments to date on the Yemen crisis. He urged all sides to implement the fragile peace deal that was reached in December and to help deliver aid to millions of people who are suffering. He spoke about the children in particular. His words here in UAE were welcomed by the foreign minister, who said in a tweet, "Let's make 2019 the year of peace." So it's very possible that the Pope will raise his concerns about Yemen here again today.
Okay. Sylvia, thanks so much for the reporting. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.
NPR's Sylvia Poggioli is traveling with the Pope in Abu Dhabi.
President Trump will deliver the State of the Union tonight, but he will do it in Nancy Pelosi's house.
Or the People's House, as some lawmakers like to call it. The Speaker of the House will convene the speech that she delayed during the partial government shutdown. President Trump is still demanding a border wall, the demand that drove that shutdown, and he addresses lawmakers with border security still unresolved and a deadline looming. Some of the lawmakers who will be in the room tonight are working on compromise, but the president has said he doubts that will work, and he's been talking of bypassing Congress by declaring a state of emergency.
NPR White House reporter Aisha Roscoe is with us this morning. Hey, Aisha.
Good morning.
The White House typically gives a readout on what to expect from the State of the Union themes they're going to focus on. What are you hearing?
So while this president is known for breaking traditions, the White House is stressing that this State of the Union will be pretty traditional. Trump is going to deliver a unifying message, according to officials. Here's how Trump framed the speech when he was asked about this last week.
I think it's unification. I think it's industry. I think it's about the people that you see right here. It's also working with these people because they've been incredible. We have had some incredible report, and we've had incredible Republican support.
Presumably, Aisha, he was with some business leaders or something when he gave his remarks?
Yes, given these remarks. And so there's going to be talk of kind of bridging old divisions and healing wounds. And this is supposed to be Trump at his most optimistic and kind of presenting his vision for the future. But there will be a pitch for border security, and he's expected to advocate for a wall. But the White House says there are areas where they believe that Trump will be able to find some common ground with Democrats. For instance, spending on rebuilding U.S. infrastructure. And then there's Trump's push to lower healthcare costs and prescriptions. And they hope that's an area where there might be some compromise.
We should just note, we've been hearing about infrastructure and its bipartisan possibilities for at least 2 years.
Is this infrastructure week again this week?
Infrastructure week always. Yes.
Always. Steve mentioned that the president has made no secret about exploring the possibility of declaring a state of emergency to get the border wall funding. Any idea whether or not he's going to use the speech to again threaten that?
The president has said, stay tuned when it comes to this idea of declaring a national emergency. But the thought is that it's unlikely that he will do it tonight. Anything is possible, but that would likely overshadow this idea of unification if you throw out such a polarizing idea. But what officials have said that Trump will try to do is point to areas where there has been agreement and compromise over the past 2 years. For instance, when it came to changing drug sentencing laws and promoting job training programs to prisoners in this bill called the First Step Act, that was a bipartisan bill or a law that passed last year. And you're going to have some of the beneficiaries of that bill, of that new law in the audience at the State of the Union.
You know, Aisha mentioned some areas where there is conceivable compromise, but we should note this president periodically has called for unity, going all the way back to his primary campaign. From time to time, he's called for unity, but like many a politician, when he calls for unity, he typically ends up saying something like, everyone unify behind my position. Come on. And so it's a hard thing to do.
Right. The Democrats get a chance to weigh in. What do we know about the Democratic response after the speech, Aisha?
Stacey Abrams, the Democrat who ran for governor of Georgia last year, will be giving the response. She didn't win that election, but she's viewed as a rising star in the Democratic Party.
NPR White House reporter Aisha Rado with a preview of the speech. Thanks, Aisha.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to pivot and talk about what is happening in the state of Virginia. And what is happening in the state of Virginia is a whole lot of political uncertainty.
Yeah, days ago, the discovery of an old racist photo in a yearbook of Governor Ralph Northam prompted people to ask, who's next in line to be governor? Well, it's Justin Fairfax, the lieutenant governor. But now people are checking just to be sure about who is third in line because Fairfax faces accusations of his own.
We are joined on the line from Richmond, Virginia by Mallory No Payne of member station WVTF. Mallory, thanks for being here.
Good morning.
Explain the allegation against the lieutenant governor.
So, a conservative blog, the same one that actually first published the photo of Northam, published an allegation of sexual assault against the lieutenant governor. So
this is from a few years back, right?
It is. It's from before he was married. He was in his mid-20s. The accuser hasn't spoken publicly, so there's really not much that we know, except for that he came out denying the allegation. He presides over the state Senate, so he was working as usual yesterday, and he stepped out of the Senate. Reporters just surrounded him and gave him the chance to respond.
I think we've actually got tape of that. Let's listen to him.
Does anybody think it's any coincidence that on the eve of potentially my being elevated, that's when this uncorroborated smear comes out? Does anybody believe that's a coincidence?
So it sounds like he's blaming fellow Democrats here.
Well, so he's either blaming fellow Democrats or he's blaming the conservative blog that chose to run this information now. The Washington Post actually said that this accuser approached them with the story about a year ago. They chose not to run the story because it was a he said, she said situation. They couldn't corroborate it in any way.
We should clarify, he intimated further in that clip that it could be supporters of Governor Northam himself who don't like the idea of Fairfax taking over. Have we heard anything more from Governor Northam at this point?
No. Governor Northam's spokeswoman did come out and say that it was 100% not true that these accusations somehow come back to Northam or his people at all. but it's been more than 36 hours since Northam's last public appearance or public statement of any kind. So we don't know what the governor is thinking at this point.
So let's just play this out. Let us imagine a scenario where Northam, the pressure on him to resign is just too much. He feels he can't govern, so he leaves. And Fairfax, let's play this out. Hypothetically, is forced to step down. Who'd be third in line?
The Attorney General. His name is Mark Herring. He's also a Democrat. He actually had already announced plans to run for governor in 2020. So he planned, or hoped at least, to follow Northam. So who knows? He may get that job sooner than expected. Not out of the realm of possibility.
Oh, so he's thinking of running in 2021, but now he has to be prepared. Who knows? Who knows?
Right. Lots of unanswered questions at this point. Mallory No Pain for member station WVTF in Richmond. Mallory, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
The clock is ticking on a 1987 arms control agreement that symbolized the end of the Cold War.
It's called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the Trump administration announced last week that the United States is dropping out. It's set to expire in the next 6 months. Now, in his announcement the other day, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the United States has spent the past 6 years trying to get the Russians to follow the treaty.
We have raised Russia's noncompliance with Russian officials, including at the highest levels of government, more than 30 times. Yet Russia continues to deny that its missile system is noncompliant and violates the treaty.
So how is Russia responding?
Let's ask NPR's Lucian Kim in Moscow. Good morning, Lucian.
Good morning.
So we're clear on the U.S. position, but what has President Putin said about this?
Well, President Putin says the U.S. was never interested in saving the INF Treaty and is using Russian noncompliance, which of course the Kremlin denies, as a pretext to end it. Putin said over the weekend that Russia's response will be symmetrical. That means Russia will also suspend its participation in the treaty and will reserve the right to develop weapons banned under it. I think what's interesting here is that Putin made sure to emphasize that these new weapons won't require any extra spending. This is a very sensitive subject right now in Russia. It seems like Russians right now are more interested in butter than they are in guns. And Putin, of course, remembers very well that the Soviet Union basically went bankrupt trying to keep up with the U.S. arms spending during the Cold War.
So they insist that they're complying with this deal? I mean, do they have any evidence that they are?
Russia insists that they are complying. A couple of weeks ago, they even presented the launch tube and launch vehicle of the missile in question. But American officials have dismissed this as a public relations stunt.
But you say that this will now allow Russia to expand their missile program, essentially, to be able to produce the kinds of weapons that were banned under the INF, which raises the question, is this the best way to contain Russia's ambitions, just allowing them to move forward?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the weapons banned under the INF Treaty are intermediate range. So that means U.S. missiles based in Europe and Russian missiles aimed at Europe. For the moment, NATO has said it's not interested in basing these kinds of American missiles in Europe, and Russia says for now he won't deploy any new weapons until the U.S. does.
Okay, so if we look forward here, if this treaty expires, as it looks like that will be the outcome, there is only one major nuclear weapons treaty that will still bind the U.S. and Russia. This is the New START Treaty, which basically limits the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads. That is set to expire in 2 years. What's the health of that agreement right now?
Well, from what we know, Russia is interested in extending this treaty. It was signed by President Obama and his then counterpart, Dmitry Medvedev, sort of as a symbol of their reset in relations. As you said, this treaty seeks to reduce strategic weapons. Those are those long-range missiles that Russia has aimed at the U.S. and the U.S. has aimed at Russia. So far, the Russians say their attempts to start renewal negotiations have been ignored by the Trump administration.
All right, NPR's Lucian Kim reporting for us on Russia's reaction to the announcement by the Trump administration that they will suspend American participation in the INF Treaty. Lucian, thanks. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
President Trump delivered his second State of the Union address last night.
His aides had forecast a call for unity, and the president did open with a call for bipartisanship and unity.
We must reject the politics of revenge, resistance, and retribution, and embrace the boundless potential of cooperation, compromise, and the common good.
A lot of alliteration there, although the president later returned to more familiar themes and divisive rhetoric on border security that led to the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. That shutdown was nowhere to be found in the nearly 90-minute speech.
And let's talk about that speech with NPR national political correspondent Mara Liasson. Mara, good morning.
Good morning, David.
So in almost 90 minutes, he's getting like into Bill Clinton territory in terms of length, it sounds like.
Yeah, it was pretty long.
So what did you take away from the evening as you listened?
Well, my biggest takeaway was that the big question of the speech remained unanswered, which is what was going to be his approach to the new era of divided government. The speech almost suggested he hasn't decided yet. It was two speeches grafted together. One was this standard rally speech about immigration and abortion and socialism. The other one offered some olive branches to Democrats on infrastructure, prescription drug prices, paid family leave. We still don't know which way he wants to go. And my other takeaway was that he did offer this gracious grace note when he acknowledged that there were more women than ever before in Congress. What he didn't say, of course, is there are actually fewer Republican women and there were more Democratic women. And the other big takeaway was just the visual of the sea of women in white suits on one side of the aisle and then a lot of men in dark suits on the other one.
Wow, yeah, quite a contrast, quite a reminder. This is a very different Congress he is facing as we enter these next 2 years. I was struck that he did not once bring up the government shutdown, which, has been making so much news and is such an example of the gridlock in Washington. He just shied away from that totally.
Yes, because why would he bring it up? It was a bad thing for him, and his approval ratings dropped during it. He kind of lost the first skirmish of the shutdown. There were other things that were absent. He didn't congratulate Nancy Pelosi for ascending to the speakership. He seemed to start his speech really quickly as if to preempt her ability to introduce him, which is the typical role of the speaker. He also didn't give a lot of details about the proposals where there might be bipartisanship. He kind of glossed over family leave, infrastructure, and drug prices. The other thing that I thought was missing was no national emergency talk, even though he's been laying the groundwork for that. He did say, "I will build the wall," as if suggesting he might do it himself. But we didn't hear anything about that last night.
Well, we did hear a lot about the shutdown from Democrats, and the Democratic response, this official Democratic response, came from Stacey Abrams, who's really a rising star in the party. She recently lost her bid to become Georgia's governor really narrowly. But let's take a quick listen here.
The shutdown was a stunt engineered by the President of the United States, one that defied every tenet of fairness and abandoned not just our people, but our values.
So, Mara, as you listen to that, how can we characterize the message Democrats are sending the morning after this big speech?
I think we can say that they have a completely different vision of the problems facing the country than the president. In other words, for the Democrats, for Stacey Abrams, the real crisis is voter suppression, paying for college, stagnant wages. For the president, the crisis is illegal immigrants coming over the border to kill us, even though illegal immigration is at its lowest since 2000. But it was two completely different worldviews.
NPR national political correspondent Mara Liasson speaking to us the morning after the State of the Union. Mara, thanks as always.
Thank you.
All right, really looming in the background of last night's State of the Union speech, another investigation that could be damaging to President Trump.
It's the investigation of the president's inaugural committee. We learned yesterday that federal prosecutors are examining the $107 million raised by that committee. And today we have new reporting. It comes from WNYC and ProPublica, and it outlines some actions by the chairman of the president's inaugural committee. That chairman is also a friend of the president, and a document suggests how his company expected to profit from that close connection.
All right, a lot to try and understand here, and WNYC's Ilya Meritz is on this story and joins us from New York. Good morning.
Good morning.
So your reporting here is based, at least in part, on a confidential memo that you got access to. Explain exactly what this is and what you learned from it.
Yeah, so it's an 8-page strategy document on company letterhead, and it talks about all the ways that this huge private equity company, Colony, with billions of dollars under management, can make money from its relationships in Washington and around the world. Colony's founder is Tom Barrack. He was an early supporter of Donald Trump's campaign, and after Trump won, he asked him to be chairman of his inaugural committee. So Inauguration Day comes January 20th, 2017, brings a lot of rich people from around the country, quite a few foreign guests, and the following month, this strategic plan is circulated outlining how Colony should set up a D.C. office. They talk about convening international ambassadors with members of the Trump administration, making new business opportunities. Here's a quote. "The key is to strategically cultivate domestic and international relations while avoiding any appearance of lobbying." And it goes on to say that no other firms, quote, "can currently match the relationships or resources that we possess."
Okay, so it was suggesting what this company how the company could benefit from a relationship with Donald Trump. Was it really specific, saying we could benefit from our involvement with the inauguration, or is that link not entirely clear?
No, the word inauguration never occurs there. It's really, I think, in the timing. This document came out, within weeks of Inauguration Day. And by the way, a spokesman did give us this statement. He said the memo was simply an outline of a proposed potential business plan, which was never acted upon or implemented. Colony at no time has maintained a D.C. office. That is true, but we also found evidence that Colony may have been pursuing precisely the kind of convening situations that were spelled out in that memo. One example, April 2017, Tom Barrack had dinner with Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and seven Middle East ambassadors in a private room in a restaurant in Washington, D.C. The entry in Mnuchin's calendar said, "Personal dinner, Tom B."
But potential access there.
Yes.
Explain to me, if you can, Ilya. I mean, federal prosecutors subpoenaed the inauguration committee earlier this week. How might this fit into that larger investigation?
Well, prosecutors want to know everything they can about the money coming in, the money going out of the inauguration. Remember, this inauguration took in a lot more money than any other has, so there's a lot of cash to follow. And when it comes to answering prosecutors' questions, that will now be the task of Tom Barrack, former chairman of the committee, private businessman, friend of the president. He's the one who's going to have to respond and produce documents.
WNYC's Ilya Meritz, also co-host of the Trump Inc. podcast about the Trump family business, which is worth listening to learn much more about all this kind of stuff. Ilya, thanks a lot.
You're very welcome.
All right, we're going to turn now to Rome and the Catholic Church.
Pope Francis has acknowledged a dark secret of the Church. In a press conference, he affirmed that priests and even bishops have sexually abused Catholic nuns. That remark adds to the long-running scandal of sexual abuse by priests.
All right, I want to bring in NPR's Sylvia Poggioli, who has been traveling with the Pope. Good morning.
Good morning.
So we have heard so much, I mean, from your reporting and lots of other reporting about the sexual abuse of children by priests, but I don't think I knew much about nuns in the church being abused. I mean, is this something that's been in these circles for a long time?
Oh, absolutely. It's been an open secret. It's particularly a problem in places like Asia, some Latin American countries, and Africa. I remember talking to an African nun at a meeting of African bishops at the Vatican back in the 90s, and she spoke about the issue very openly. But it's always been really hard for nuns to be heard. It said that in some cases, nuns who have reported abuse were kicked out of their orders or moved elsewhere. It's an open secret, and many abused women believe that the Catholic Church has mostly ignored the victims and spared the abusers.
Wow. And it's taken all this time for this to even be acknowledged by the Pope, which seems significant.
Yeah, probably it was the first time he was asked about it in public. And that question was prompted by a slew of recent reports on the issue. In the wake of the Me Too movement, a hashtag Nuns2 movement has emerged. Last year, an Indian nun accused a bishop of raping her over a 2-year period. He was arrested and he faces trial later this year. Just last month, a top official in the Vatican doctrinal office that handles allegations of clerical sex abuse, he resigned after a former nun accused him of making sexual advances during confession. He denies the accusation. And then last November, the International Union of Superiors General, that's the organization that represents the world's female Catholic religious orders, they denounced the culture of silence and secrecy that prevents nuns from speaking out. And just last week, an article in the magazine Women, Church, and the World, it's part of the official Vatican newspaper, the editor, a Catholic feminist, pinned blame for the abuse of women in the church on the culture of clericalism. And that's the same power dynamic that's blamed for the clerical sex abuse of minors across the globe.
So, Sylvia, did the Pope say he's going to do anything about this?
He acknowledged there are priests and even bishops who have abused nuns. He said several priests have been suspended, but he believes the problem still exists. And he said, should I do something more be done? Yes. Is there a will? Yes. But it's a path we've already began. But these latest reports will certainly add pressure on the Pope to deal much more forcefully with the issue at the special summit he's convened at the end of this month to find a way to respond to the continuing revelations of clerical abuse of minors. And these are scandals that are jeopardizing his moral legacy.
NPR Sylvia Poggioli. Sylvia, thanks.
Thank you.
Today, dozens of Democrats in the House of Representatives state their priorities in fighting climate change.
Yeah, they're offering legislation that has been labeled a Green New Deal, and the lawmakers involved include one just arrived, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Even the solutions that we have considered big and bold are nowhere near the scale of the actual problem that climate change presents to us, to our country, and to the world.
Now, Ocasio-Cortez is a freshman among the least senior members of the House, but the self-described Democratic Socialist has received enormous attention since upsetting a senior New York lawmaker in a primary last year. With dozens of co-sponsors, she presents a resolution today. It would promote wind and solar energy and call for the U.S. to have net zero carbon emissions in 10 years. She talked about this in an NPR interview.
The thing about a Green New Deal is that it's not an outright ban on any source of energy. And that's my opinion as one member of Congress. And one of the big goals that we have is that we're trying to just sketch out a blueprint and work with other members to get there.
NPR political editor Domenico Montanaro is here and has been reading an advance copy of that blueprint, that resolution. Hi there, Domenico.
Good morning, Steve.
So what's it say?
You know, this is a non-binding resolution, and as we noted, some of what it does, being carbon neutral by 2030 is one of those things that a lot of experts say is not only ambitious, but almost impossible to pull off. Experts shoot for more like 2050, and that's considered ambitious. It would also eliminate most, if not all, air travel, in fact, because of how it wants to restructure things like high-speed rail. So very ambitious, not a lot of specifics as far as how to get to those things, but certainly laying down a marker for where liberals want to go in addressing climate change.
Largely eliminate air travel, which is considered to be really bad for planet, for carbon levels in the atmosphere, and trying to get people in a different direction. But you're saying it's essentially it's a set of notions or ideas. It would actually require big legislation later to enact these ideas.
Yeah, or small legislation, having to enact various numbers of these ideas to flesh this out. And it's going to be a really difficult thing to actually enact as far as getting it on the floor, because getting it to a vote is not something that a lot of moderate Democrats are going to be wanting to have to walk the plank on, frankly.
Let's talk about that. What would the reluctance be of Democratic leaders to buy into this Green New Deal notion?
Well, it's a plan that would cost trillions upon trillions of dollars, to be quite honest, and it's not something that would ever pass the Republican-controlled Senate. Now, all of that is practical and looking at the actual politics of the day. Of course, liberals are going to say that this is, a bold step forward that they can argue for and win people over on. And that very well may be the case, but Democrats in 2009 took a step with cap and trade, which was far less dramatic than this plan would be. It passed the House, didn't pass the Senate, and a lot of Democrats feel like they suffered some consequences along with the passage of Obamacare in the 2010 midterm elections. And let's remember, the reason Democrats won in the 2018 midterms, while Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is able to get so much attention for herself and for the things that she wants to do, this election was really won on the backs of moderates.
Oh, moderates who were able to win in suburban areas that had been Republican before.
Right.
Domenico, thanks so much.
You're so welcome.
That's NPR's Domenico Montanaro. All right, when President Trump delivered his State of the Union speech the other night, almost all members of Congress and almost all members of the cabinet attended. One cabinet member was the designated survivor, designated to stay away just in case of calamity.
Well, in the state of Virginia, if they were to take that precaution, it might need to designate one top official to hide out from scandal. The top 3 officials in that state are all facing serious questions now. Governor Ralph Northam faces pressure to resign over an old racist photo. The Lieutenant Governor, Justin Fairfax, is publicly accused by a woman who says he sexually assaulted her in 2004. And now the state's 3rd-ranking official, Attorney General Mark Herring, has admitted that he donned blackface at a college party in the 80s.
NPR's Sarah McCammon, a resident of Virginia, has been following all this and is in our studio. Sarah, good morning.
Hi, Steve.
So Lieutenant Governor Fairfax has been fending off these allegations for a number of days, but now the woman who accused him has stepped forward with a written statement. What have you learned?
Right, and her name is Vanessa Tyson. We had not been naming her until yesterday when she came forward to tell her story. She's a politics professor at Scripps College in California and currently a fellow at Stanford. And in a detailed statement, she says, quote, "What began as consensual kissing quickly turned into a sexual assault," she says, by Justin Fairfax. This was in 2004, she says, at the Democratic National Convention in Boston.
They were both working at the convention, right? And staying in a hotel.
They were both there, and they met there. And where the story gets more complicated is it initially surfaced on a conservative blog based on a private social media post that Tyson had made where she appeared to allude to this. And she also had told her story to the Washington Post over a year ago. They checked it out, said they couldn't corroborate either version of events and decided not to publish. But now she says this has all come out and she wants to set the record straight. She says she's coming forward with tremendous anguish, though, to tell her story.
Fairfax originally said when vaguer versions of this story were out there, this is a political smear. What is he saying now that more specific allegations are public?
He's repeatedly denied this, and in a new statement yesterday, he says Tyson's allegations are surprising and hurtful, but he has to dispute her version of events. And he also said he wanted to emphasize how important it is to listen to women when they come forward. We should also note he's retained a law firm, the same one that represented Brett Kavanaugh during his Senate confirmation hearings when he was accused of sexual assault. And now the National Organization for Women is calling for Fairfax to resign.
So the big picture here, we have a governor who's been accused involving this old racist photo. We have the lieutenant governor with the allegations we just discussed. The attorney general, who is number 3 in the line of succession, has said he wore blackface at one time. Don't have any indications that any of these officials would resign. But what if? What if all 3 of them did have to resign?
Well, we should say, Steve, they're all 3 Democrats. So this creates challenges for the Democratic Party on a number of levels, one of which is that the number 4 in line is the House Speaker, who is a Republican. His name is Kirk Cox. And you may remember that weird election about a year ago where there was an undecided House race in Virginia that had to be decided by casting lots.
Oh, because they were so close. There was a
close.
drawing to decide the winner of that one legislative seat.
That went to a Republican. Republicans stayed in control of the Virginia House of Delegates.
By that one seat.
By that one seat. And now Kirk Cox, their speaker, is number 4 in line for the governorship. So it is a mess in Virginia right now.
Wow. And we'll continue listening for your reporting on that mess. Sarah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Sarah McCammon. It's been 3 months since the most destructive and deadliest fire in California history burned almost the entire town of Paradise.
Yeah, the Camp Fire also wiped out 15% of housing stock in a county overnight. Now, while some residents have left, others with less means have had no choice but to camp out on their properties. But here's the thing. The federal government says they won't pay for a cleanup if people are living there. You can imagine this is not very popular. The mayor of Paradise, Jody Jones, says there's no choice but to somehow take in federal aid.
If we don't do it, our town will look like a war zone for the next 20 years because we are broke.
NPR's Kirk Siegler has been traveling in paradise. He joins us now. Hi, Kirk.
Hey, Steve.
What's the town look like?
Well, when you hear the mayor there, Mayor Jones, saying it's a war zone, that's not an exaggeration. I've been up there for about a month reporting a longer-term project, and every time I drive around the town, it's still just shocking to look at. It's rubble. It's built as a town, but it was really a city of 25,000 people. The Safeway's gone. Whole neighborhoods are gone. Fast food restaurants are still leveled, and they're still in that state 3 months on. There just really hasn't been a whole lot of recovery yet, and that burned area where people can't live on their burned out properties was declared a public health disaster for a reason. You can't drink the water still in Paradise. There's benzene seeping into the water supply. There's other toxins in the ash when the wind blows up. It's Sarah said, mess. It's still a mess in Paradise.
Do you nevertheless run into residents from time to time as you move about town?
You do, and there was some sort of ruckus public meetings this week over the proposals to ban camping again for residents who had been told that they could move back, and now they can't. And this is a big source of tension, as you can imagine, because the town is basically a skeleton, and there was already a housing shortage before the fire, so if people are able to hang on and try to hold out and wait for the recovery, it's not sure where they'll even live. I met Martha Bryant, who was born and raised in Paradise, and, she called this week, yet another setback, and she worries that more people will just give up and leave.
It's their property. They're adults. They know the risks. We don't need other people, the county, and everybody else telling us how we should live our lives.
And Steve, this is a rural part of the country where there was a lot of mistrust of the government already before the fire. And when a disaster like this happens, at least for now, places like this are basically wholly dependent on federal and state aid to even just recover.
What reassurances and plans are officials offering?
Well, just the toxic debris removal itself, the cleanup, they're saying will hopefully just take a few months for some residents, but it could be a year or more. A lot of people I talk to expect it to be at least a year. Federal disaster officials say they have not seen a, toxic debris removal like this in this country since 9/11. So there's a whole lot of work to be done even before the town can start asking the bigger questions. Should it rebuild, and how should it rebuild in a high-risk zone like that?
Kirk, thanks very much for your reporting, and we look forward also to that long-term project when you're done.
Glad to do it. Thanks, Steve.
That's NPR's Kirk Siegler, who has been traveling in Paradise, California.